Three tiny German Shepherd puppies huddled together in the corner of a rescue kennel. Their mother gone, their bowls untouched, their bodies growing weaker by the hour. They had survived the place they came from, but could they survive losing the only mother they had ever known? Then Jason Miller, a 38-year-old Navy SEAL who had only come to deliver supplies, found himself sitting quietly beside them. He knew how to protect people. He knew how to follow a plan. But what could he do for three frightened puppies who no longer wanted to eat? And if they learned to depend on him, what would happen when the day came for them to live without him? Then, 18 months later, why would one of those puppies need to see him again? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late February lay quietly over Lake Placid, New York, with old snow along the roads and a thin gray sky above the Adirondacks. Inside Adirondack Animal Rescue, three 7-week-old German Shepherd puppies had spent 3 days pressed together in the corner of a heated kennel. Their mother, a black and tan shepherd weakened by poor conditions before the rescue, had arrived with them after authorities closed an illegal breeding operation. She died during the first night from complications of exhaustion, dehydration, and illness after giving birth. The puppies had no serious injuries, yet something in them seemed to have gone still. Ellie, the smallest female, had a soft black and tan coat, one ear that tipped slightly outward, and dark brown eyes that looked unusually solemn. By the third day, she could stand only briefly before lowering herself again. Max, the largest male, had broad paws and a darker facial mask. He often positioned himself in front of Ellie and Charlie, as if his small body could replace the protection they had lost. Charlie, leaner and more restless, whined whenever a staff member separated one puppy for examination. Dr. Rebecca Lawson had tried every gentle feeding method she considered reasonable. At 49, Rebecca was tall and slim, with chestnut hair threaded with gray, usually tied at the nape of her neck, and a composed face shaped by more than 20 years in veterinary medicine. She was patient but unsentimental, the kind of doctor who cared deeply without pretending care could solve everything. Warm formula, softened food, smaller portions, quieter handling, nothing lasted. The more pressure the puppies felt, the farther they withdrew. "They're hungry," Rebecca said softly. "But hunger isn't the strongest thing in the room anymore." Jason Miller arrived that afternoon carrying donated blankets and a folded exercise pen. He had not come looking for a dog. Jason was 38, an active-duty Navy SEAL temporarily assigned to stateside training, and he had agreed to help move supplies because it was a simple job with a clear ending. He stood 6'2", broad-shouldered and athletic, with short dark brown hair, a faint touch of gray at the temples, a neatly trimmed beard, and blue-gray eyes that missed little. His manner was courteous but controlled. Years of work had taught him to trust preparation, routines, and problems that could be broken into steps. What unsettled him were situations in which doing more could make things worse. Rebecca noticed him stop when Charlie cried. She explained the puppy's situation and asked him to sit quietly near the open kennel while she prepared another feeding attempt. Jason lowered himself to the floor but did not reach inside. Max watched him. Charlie shifted forward, then stopped. Ellie remained curled against the back wall. After several minutes, Charlie crept closer. A little later, Ellie raised her head and moved perhaps a foot toward Jason. Rebecca noticed. Jason did too. Neither called it trust. Before heading home, Jason stopped at Helen Carter's house to repair a loose garage hinge. Helen had been his parents' neighbor for nearly 40 years and had known Jason since childhood. At 70, she was still straight-backed and neatly dressed, with silver blonde hair cut at her jaw, pale, weathered skin, and bright green eyes that could become sharp when someone underestimated her. Widowed 6 years earlier, Helen had learned to dislike the gentle, careful tone people sometimes used with older women when they had already decided what was best for them. Jason noticed a brochure on her kitchen table for a senior living community near Albany. He asked if she was considering moving, then immediately began discussing winter access. medical care, maintenance costs, and transportation. Helen let him speak for almost a minute before saying, "Did I ask you which choice was best?" Jason frowned. "I'm trying to help." "You're trying to finish the problem before I've told you what the problem is." He set the brochure down. Helen's expression softened, but her words did not. "You've always been good at keeping people safe, Jason. Sometimes you forget they still need to be allowed to choose." Jason left irritated, mostly because some part of him knew she was right. Rebecca called before he reached the cabin. Ellie had eaten almost nothing, the shelter was full, and the constant sounds of doors, voices, and other animals seemed to keep all three puppies tense. Rebecca did not ask Jason to adopt them. She asked for 3 days in a quieter place. "Minimal handling," she said. "Let them sleep." Let them discover that nothing is being demanded of them. Jason looked through the windshield at light snow beginning to fall. Why all 3? Separating them right now makes the panic worse. 3 days? Then we reassess. He nearly refused. His schedule was already crowded, and he knew military working dogs far better than frightened 7-week-old puppies. Then Helen's sentence returned. "You're trying to finish the problem before I've told you what the problem is." By evening, Ellie, Max, and Charlie were riding toward his family cabin in a padded travel crate. The cabin sat among tall pines outside Lake Placid, warm, plain, and quiet, with dark wood floors, a stone fireplace, and an old pendulum clock that had run 7 minutes slow since Jason was a boy, because his father had never bothered to repair it. Jason settled the puppies in the kitchen and followed Rebecca's directions precisely. He warmed formula, softened food, used shallow bowls, kept his movements slow, and gave them space. Max sniffed and turned away. Charlie licked once before retreating. Ellie did not lift her head. Jason changed positions, waited, moved farther away, then closer. Nothing worked. His concern slowly turned into frustration, not with the puppies, but with the fact that effort itself seemed useless. Eventually, he stopped trying. He dimmed the lights, sat with his back against a cabinet, and let the room become still. Charlie moved first, crawling until his side touched Jason's boot. Max followed, watchful but tired. Ellie came last and curled against her brothers, close enough that one small paw rested against Jason's leg. Near midnight, Ellie stirred. Jason saw her nose turn toward a spoonful of softened food nearby. He picked it up, then resisted the urge to bring it to her mouth. Instead, he lowered the spoon to the floor and waited. Ellie sniffed it. He licked once, paused, then licked again. Jason did not praise her or touch her. It was only a few mouthfuls, nowhere near enough to call the problem solved. But as the tiny dog settled back against Max and Charlie, Jason remained on the kitchen floor listening to the slow clock in the next room. For the first time, he understood that food had never been the first problem. Before the puppies could accept nourishment, they needed something harder to measure. Enough safety to believe that reaching for it would not cost them anything. Morning settled pale and cold over the pines outside Lake Placid. The kind of late winter morning when snow seemed less beautiful than tired, crusted along the edges of the driveway and sagging from the lower branches. Jason Miller had slept perhaps 2 hours. He woke on the kitchen floor with one shoulder against a cabinet, Charlie curled near his boot, Max wedged protectively beside Ellie, and the old pendulum clock in the next room still insisting that time was 7 minutes behind the rest of the world. Ellie had eaten only a few mouthfuls during the night, but for Jason those few mouthfuls had become something dangerously close to hope. His first instinct was to improve on them. More food, better timing, a clearer system. By 7 in the morning he had already written a feeding schedule on a yellow legal pad when his phone rang. Dr. Rebecca Lawson listened while Jason reported exactly how many bites Ellie had taken. "You counted them?" she asked. "Approximately." "That means yes." Jason glanced at Ellie. "I need to know whether she's improving." "You need to know whether she feels safe enough to keep trying." Rebecca told him not to turn the kitchen into a training room. Same bowls, same place, same quiet routine. Put the food down, then step away. No coaxing every 30 seconds, no moving the bowl toward Ellie every time she looked at it, and no watching her so intently that she felt like she was taking an exam. Jason looked at his neat schedule. So the plan is to do less. For today, yes. I'm not especially good at that. I noticed. Charlie surprised him first. The lean little male woke hungry enough to forget some of his fear. He approached the softened food, sniffed, backed away when the refrigerator clicked, then returned and ate several quick mouthfuls. Max watched Charlie before moving toward his own bowl. Even while eating, Max kept glancing sideways at his brother and sister, his dark mask making his small face look more serious than a 7-week-old puppy had any right to look. Ellie stayed curled near the kennel door. Jason sat at the kitchen table and forced himself not to intervene. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Charlie finished first and looked ready to investigate Max's bowl, but Jason quietly guided him away without touching Max's food. Ellie never approached hers. That first day was made of small successes too fragile to celebrate. Charlie ate twice. Max ate once well and once poorly. Ellie took a little formula but turned away from most of the softened food. By evening, Jason had learned that progress was much easier to recognize when it belonged to someone else. When it was happening 6 feet from him, under his responsibility, it never seemed like enough. The night brought another problem. Ellie woke whenever the cabin became completely still. She would lift her head, realize no human was nearby, and begin a thin, uncertain whine. The sound was not loud, but it pulled Jason out of sleep more effectively than an alarm. The first time he carried his blanket from the sofa and lay on the floor outside the puppy pen. Ellie stopped within minutes. The second time he tried returning to the sofa after she settled. She woke again. By the third attempt, Jason gave up pretending he was going back to bed. He lay on the rug with one forearm beneath his head and stared at the shadowed ceiling. Charlie snored softly. Max twitched in sleep. Ellie's breathing finally slowed. Jason had spent much of his adult life respecting endurance. People praised those who could keep going when tired, frightened, cold, or uncertain. Yet watching 3 tiny animals, he wondered how often human beings mistook endurance for health. Something could continue moving and still be overwhelmed. Something could remain alive and still spend every moment expecting the next bad thing. Older people understood that better than most, he thought unexpectedly. He had heard Helen say once that after a certain age everyone congratulated you for still doing ordinary things, as if survival itself had become a performance. The next afternoon, Jason drove to Helen Carter's house to check the front steps. He told himself he was only stopping by because her driveway was on the route back from town. He found her outside with a snow shovel. "Helen," she looked up. "Jason? You said your knee hurt." "It does." "Then why are you shoveling?" "Because the snow has not developed the courtesy to remove itself." Jason crossed the yard and took the shovel from her before thinking. Helen's expression hardened instantly. "No." "You can barely bend that knee. I can bend it enough. I'll hire someone to do this. You will do no such thing without asking me." Jason exhaled through his nose. "The porch is icy. You're 70. This isn't complicated." Helen became very still. Jason recognized the mistake a second too late. "This," she said, pointing at him with one gloved finger, "is exactly what I was talking about. I'm trying to keep you from falling, and I am trying to remain the person who decides what happens in my own house. You could get hurt." "Yes." Helen's voice softened, which somehow made the words land harder. "And one day, I will need more help than I want. One day, I may have to give up driving. I may have to leave this house. I may have to let my daughters make decisions with me that I would rather make alone. I know all of that, Jason. I think about it more than you do." He said nothing. "What frightens me," Helen continued, "isn't getting old. It's becoming invisible inside my own life. It's people talking around me, deciding for me, smiling kindly while they take one choice after another because they think being worried gives them the right. Jason looked at the shovel in his hand. He still believed she should not be clearing an icy porch with a painful knee. That part had not changed. But for the first time he could see how quickly concern became authority when the stronger person assumed his fear mattered more than the other person's dignity. He handed the shovel back. Helen raised one eyebrow. I still think this is a bad idea. I know. What if I clear the lower steps and you do the porch? Helen considered it. You're learning negotiation. Don't get excited. She smiled despite herself. How are the puppies? Still trying. That sounds more honest than better. Back at the cabin, the second day passed without anything dramatic. That was beginning to feel like good news. Charlie ate each meal. Max followed more consistently. Ellie ate a little more when Jason placed the bowl down and walked to the far side of the kitchen. She still needed the presence of her brothers to settle, and that night Jason again slept close to the puppy pen. But he stopped trying to predict exactly when she would wake. He simply kept a blanket there. On the third day, Rebecca visited. She weighed each puppy and examined them calmly, allowing pauses whenever they became tense. All three had gained a small amount. Ellie remained the weakest, but her eyes were brighter, and she resisted less when Rebecca listened to her heart. They're moving in the right direction, Rebecca said. Jason glanced at the calendar. Today is day 3. I know. You said 3 days. I said we'd reassess in 3 days. That is not the same sentence. No, it isn't. The shelter was still crowded. More importantly, Rebecca believed moving the puppies again while they were just beginning to stabilize could undo some of their progress. How much longer? Jason asked. 2 weeks would give us a much clearer picture. Jason stared at her. Charlie chose that moment to bite the lace of Jason's boot and pull backward with surprising determination. Rebecca smiled. He seems comfortable with the arrangement. Jason looked down at the puppy. He's destroying government property. Those are your boots. Exactly. Jason did not say yes immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the pines, calculating training days, travel time, feeding schedules, and everything else that could go wrong. 3 days had been temporary. 2 weeks had edges. He could work with edges. 2 weeks, he said. Rebecca nodded. 2 weeks. Neither of them said what would happen afterward. That night, for the first time, Jason slept on the sofa instead of the floor. Max and Charlie settled together in the pen. Ellie whined once, then quieted. Hours later, a faint sound woke him. Not crying, chewing. Jason sat up and listened. The kitchen was dim except for the small light above the stove. Ellie stood beside one of the bowls. Max and Charlie were still asleep several feet away. She took a few bites, paused, ate again. Jason did not move. After less than a minute, Ellie returned to her brothers and curled between them. The moment was so small that no one else would have thought to remember it. Jason knew he would. For the first time since losing her mother, Ellie had chosen food without Charlie going first, without Max standing beside her, and without Jason sitting on the floor. It was not independence, not yet. But it was the first quiet proof that safety, once given long enough, might eventually become something she could carry inside herself. By the middle of March, winter around Lake Placid had begun to loosen its grip. Snow still covered the shaded ground beneath the pines, but the roads ran dark and wet in the afternoon, and water dripped steadily from the cabin roof whenever the sun appeared. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Ellie, Max, and Charlie had arrived, and the 3 German Shepherd puppies no longer looked like creatures trying to disappear from the world. Their ribs were less noticeable beneath thickening black and tan coats. Their eyes had brightened, and their paws seemed to grow overnight. Charlie had discovered that socks were apparently a form of prey. Max had decided the rug in front of the fireplace belonged to him whenever sunlight touched it. Ellie had developed an odd fascination with the old pendulum clock, tilting her head each time it chimed as if personally offended by its inaccurate opinion of time. Jason found himself laughing more than he expected, although usually immediately after saying something like, "Absolutely not," to an animal that had already done exactly what it had been told not to do. Their recovery should have made everything easier. Instead, getting healthy gave each puppy enough energy to reveal a completely different collection of problems. Ellie remained the most cautious. She would follow Jason through the kitchen, but if he opened an unfamiliar door, she often stopped and waited until Max crossed first. If something fell from a counter, Charlie ran toward the sound, Max investigated carefully, and Ellie studied both brothers before deciding whether the world was ending. Max, meanwhile, had developed a seriousness around food that Rebecca had warned Jason might appear once his appetite returned. He ate quickly and watched anyone who came close. One morning, Charlie wandered toward Max's bowl after finishing his own, and Max gave a low, warning growl. Jason's body reacted before his mind did. He started forward, ready to intervene. Then he remembered Rebecca's instructions and stopped. He calmly redirected Charlie instead of reaching for Max's food. Max finished, stared at the empty bowl for several seconds, then finally walked away. It was not a dramatic victory. In fact, Charlie immediately attempted to eat a dish towel. But Jason was beginning to understand that some of the most important progress looked unimpressive from the outside. Charlie's problem seemed almost opposite. The puppy attacked life with comic confidence as long as his brother and sister were nearby. He chased broom bristles, climbed onto things he had no idea how to climb down from, and once dragged an empty cardboard box through the hallway while backing up because he had somehow put his head through the handle. But if Jason moved Max and Ellie into another room, Charlie changed almost instantly. His tail dropped. He rushed from doorway to doorway and cried until he found them. Courage, Jason realized, could be deceptive when it was borrowed. Jason responded the way he usually responded when several problems existed at once. He designed a system. He wrote a training schedule on the refrigerator. All 3 puppies would learn their names, sit before meals, follow simple cues, and practice settling quietly. Same times, same commands, same expectations. The plan lasted approximately 11 minutes. Jason said, "Max, sit." Max sat. Charlie saw Max sit and sat too. Ellie watched them, then sat. Jason stared at the 3 puppies. That was suspiciously easy. On the next attempt, Jason addressed Charlie first. Charlie looked at Max instead of Jason. Max sat. Charlie copied him. Ellie followed. When Jason tried using small food rewards, Max became too focused on where every piece was going. Charlie launched himself toward whichever hand appeared to contain food. Ellie simply waited for the other 2 to demonstrate what she was supposed to do. By the end of the session, Jason was standing in the kitchen with 3 puppies facing 3 different directions and a piece of treat somehow stuck to his sleeve. Rebecca arrived later that afternoon for their scheduled check. She examined the puppies, noted their steady weight gain, then watched Jason attempt another group exercise. After less than 5 minutes, she said, "Stop." Jason straightened. "That bad?" "They're learning." That sounded like a compliment. It wasn't about you. Rebecca crouched a short distance from Ellie and watched the little female look toward Max before taking 2 cautious steps forward. "You're treating them like a unit because that's how they arrived. They are a litter. They're also 3 dogs." Jason looked at Charlie, who was currently trying to remove one of his own back feet with his mouth. Rebecca continued, "They survived the first weeks by watching each other. That helped them. But now we need to find out who Ellie is without Max deciding first, who Charlie is when nobody is there to copy, and whether Max can feel secure without believing he has to manage everybody around him." Jason folded his arms. "You want me to separate them?" "For short periods, not isolate them, give them individual experiences." The distinction sounded smaller to Rebecca than it felt to Jason. The following day, Helen Carter provided an unexpected version of the same lesson. She had arranged for Jason to accompany her to look at 2 possible places to live. The first was a senior community outside Albany. A polished complex with wide hallways, transportation services, organized activities, dining options, and staff available around the clock. Jason noticed the practical advantages immediately. No icy steps, no roof repairs, no driving when the roads were bad. Helen listened politely to the tour, asked sensible questions, and looked increasingly like someone being shown a very comfortable hotel she had no intention of booking. The second place was a modest condo near downtown Lake Placid. It had 2 bedrooms, a smaller kitchen than Helen's current one, an elevator, and a short walk to a grocery store, pharmacy, library, and coffee shop. There was no dining hall, no scheduled entertainment, no one downstairs whose job was to notice if she had missed lunch. Helen stood beside the living room window overlooking a narrow street lined with bare trees. Jason said, "The Albany place has better medical access." "Yes." "Transportation?" "Yes." "More support if something changes?" "Yes, Jason." He waited for her to argue. She didn't. That made him realize he was preparing for the wrong conversation. A few months earlier, he would have begun listing reasons until one of them won. Instead, he asked, "What do you want your life to look like 5 years from now?" Helen turned toward him. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she answered quietly, "I want help when I need it. I don't want my whole day organized around the possibility that I might need help." Jason looked around the little condo again. For the first time, he stopped comparing buildings and started imagining Helen living inside them. That evening, he returned to the cabin with Rebecca's advice still bothering him. He decided Charlie would be first. Not because Charlie was weakest, but because his confidence disappeared most clearly when his siblings did. Jason left Max and Ellie inside and carried Charlie through the back door into the fenced yard. Then he set him down. At first, Charlie simply looked around. Then he turned toward the door. He scratched at it, cried, ran several yards across the snow, returned, and cried again. Jason stayed outside with him but did not pick him up. Every instinct told him the simplest solution was to open the door and restore what Charlie wanted. 2 minutes felt much longer when the creature beside you did not understand why you were saying no. Jason reached toward the handle. Then Charlie stopped. A faded blue rubber ball was half buried near the edge of the porch, where melting snow had exposed it. Charlie stared. He walked toward it cautiously, sniffed, pawed it once, then jumped backward when it rolled. A second later, he attacked it with enormous enthusiasm. Jason remained motionless. For nearly 2 minutes, Charlie forgot to check the door. He chased the ball through the wet snow, tripped over his own paws, recovered with all the dignity available to a puppy who had just fallen on his face, and chased it again. Eventually, he remembered Ellie and Max and hurried back toward the cabin. Jason opened the door then. Charlie rushed inside and found his siblings. Nothing terrible had happened. The 3 were together again. But Jason stayed by the window, looking at the abandoned blue ball outside. Charlie had not become independent in 2 minutes. That was not the point. The point was that until Jason had allowed him to be alone, neither of them had known what Charlie might do with the space. And Jason was beginning to suspect that people could make the same mistake with those they loved, holding them so carefully inside familiar boundaries that no one ever discovered who they might become beyond them. Early April came slowly to Lake Placid. The snowbanks had shrunk into gray-white ridges along the roads, and the mornings smelled less like frozen pine and more like wet earth beginning to wake underneath it. Ellie, Max, and Charlie were nearly 3 months old now, and anyone seeing them for the first time might have assumed the hardest part of their story was over. Their coats were fuller, their legs were longer, and Charlie had reached the awkward stage where his paws seemed to arrive in a room before the rest of him. Max had filled out through the chest and carried himself with the solemn confidence of a dog twice his age. Ellie remained the smallest, though her dark eyes were brighter now, and her slightly tipped ear gave her an expression Jason had begun to recognize as careful curiosity rather than fear. They ate well, played hard, slept deeply, and had begun turning Jason's cabin into the kind of home where nothing stayed exactly where it had been left. But recovery, Rebecca had warned him, did not always reveal itself by what disappeared. Sometimes it revealed itself by what became visible once the emergency was gone. Rebecca scheduled a formal behavioral assessment at Adirondack Animal Rescue after their next health check. Jason disliked transporting the puppies back to the shelter, but Rebecca wanted to observe them in a controlled environment they did not know well. She began with simple tasks: a quiet examination room, a rubber mat, a few toys. No crowd, no unnecessary handling. Max entered first without much hesitation, sniffing the doorframe and then the corners. Ellie remained at the threshold. Jason waited. Rebecca waited. Ellie looked at Max. Only after he had crossed the room did she step inside. "That," Rebecca said quietly, making a note, "is useful." "She's cautious." "Yes, but I want to know whether she's cautious because she's thinking or because she needs him to think first." Jason said nothing. Next, Rebecca asked an assistant to take Max into the adjoining room for less than a minute. Ellie froze at first, then stood near the closed door. Charlie, however, immediately began searching. He moved from Jason to the door, then to Ellie, then back again. His whining escalated until Rebecca brought Max back. Charlie rushed toward him with such relief that Jason almost laughed. Rebecca did not. The next test involved a stranger entering calmly. Max moved in front of Ellie and Charlie almost automatically, body stiff but not aggressive. The stranger stopped at a respectful distance, and Max stayed between the person and the other puppies until Rebecca redirected him. "He's appointing himself security," Jason said. "He's a puppy," Rebecca replied. "He shouldn't believe the whole room is his responsibility." That sentence landed more personally than Jason wanted to admit. The assessment continued for nearly an hour. Nothing catastrophic happened. No single reaction was alarming by itself. That was what made Rebecca's conclusion more difficult to argue with. Physically, the puppies were doing remarkably well. Emotionally, they were beginning to rely on one another in ways that could become limiting if nobody intervened. Ellie borrowed confidence from Max. Charlie borrowed regulation from both of them. Max borrowed purpose from protecting the group. Jason leaned against the examination counter. They're bonded. That's not exactly surprising. No. They lost their mother. I know. They got through it because they stayed together. Rebecca closed the folder. Also true. So why are we treating the bond like a problem? I'm not. She looked directly at him. I'm saying something can save you at one stage of life and still become something you have to grow beyond later. Jason's jaw tightened. Rebecca continued before he could answer. I'm not asking you to split them up tomorrow. I'm asking you to teach each one that being alone for a little while does not mean being abandoned. The word abandoned bothered him. They've already lost enough. And if we teach them that safety exists only when all three are touching each other, what happens when one goes to the vet? Or one needs surgery someday? Or they eventually live in different homes? Jason looked at the puppies. Charlie was trying to pull a toy from Max. Ellie watched from beside Jason's boot. He understood the logic. He simply did not like what the logic required. Later that day, Helen Carter called and asked him to come over. When Jason arrived, he found two other women at the kitchen table. Helen's older daughter, Linda Parker, 47, had driven up from Albany. Linda was a compact woman with ash-brown hair cut neatly above her shoulders, practical wire-rimmed glasses, and the brisk, organized manner of someone who had spent 20 years managing billing operations for a medical group. She loved her mother fiercely, but tended to express fear as logistics, appointments, schedules, backup plans, lists. Helen's younger daughter, Susan Carter, 44, had joined by video from Syracuse. Susan was softer-featured than Linda, with curly dark blonde hair, warm hazel eyes, and the patient voice of a high school guidance counselor. She was less forceful than her sister, though anxiety often made her agree with whoever sounded most certain. Linda got to the point quickly. Mom told us she wants the condo. Helen folded her arms. I told you because adults generally inform their families when they move. The Albany community is safer. Jason almost agreed automatically. Linda looked at him. Tell her. There it was, the role everyone expected him to play, the practical man, the Navy SEAL, the one who could turn uncertainty into a decision. A month earlier, he would have done exactly that. Instead, Jason pulled out a chair. Maybe we stop arguing about buildings. Linda frowned. What does that mean? It means we make 3 lists. Helen gave him a suspicious look. You do love a list. I'm recovering. Even Linda smiled at that. Jason wrote 3 headings on a legal pad. What Helen can do herself, what Helen is willing to accept help with, what actually creates unacceptable risk. The conversation took nearly 2 hours. It was not graceful. Linda became frustrated when Helen insisted she could still manage her own medications. Helen became offended when Susan suggested grocery delivery. Susan cried briefly after admitting she was afraid of getting a call one winter morning saying her mother had fallen and nobody had known. That changed the room. Fear sounded different when nobody disguised it as authority. Helen eventually agreed to several compromises: handrails at the condo entrance, professional snow removal, a medical alert system she could choose herself, and no driving when roads were icy. He refused to give up cooking, shopping, or living independently simply because safer alternatives existed. Linda did not love the decision. Neither did Susan. But by the end of the conversation, both understood that protecting their mother could not mean removing her from the discussion. Driving back to the cabin, Jason thought about Rebecca's 3 puppies and Helen's 3 lists. That evening, he attempted the first longer separation exercise. Nothing about it went well. Rebecca had suggested beginning with Charlie in the den, while Ellie and Max remained in the kitchen, close enough that no one was truly isolated, but far enough that Charlie had to settle without seeing them. Charlie lasted less than 2 minutes before crying. Ellie stood beside the divider and refused the food Jason offered. Max paced, then scratched repeatedly at the gate. Jason waited. 3 minutes. 4. Charlie's cries became more urgent. Jason knew Rebecca would have wanted him to reduce the difficulty rather than abandon the entire idea. But knowledge and tolerance were different things. At 5 minutes, he opened the gate. Charlie rushed through first. Ellie met him halfway. Max pushed into both of them, and within seconds the 3 puppies were pressed together, licking faces, tails moving, bodies collapsing into one relieved heap on the kitchen rug. Jason crouched beside them. There, he muttered. Tell me that's unhealthy. Rebecca happened to call several minutes later to ask how the exercise had gone. Jason described the reunion. There was a pause. Then she said, You're seeing love. Exactly. I see love too. Jason waited. Rebecca's voice softened. But are you sure there isn't fear inside it as well? After the call, Jason did not restart the exercise. He sat near the fireplace while the puppies slept together in their usual tangled pile. Charlie's chin rested across Max's back. Ellie had wedged herself between them, one paw twitching in sleep. It was beautiful. Jason could admit that. What unsettled him was the other thing he was finally willing to admit. He liked being the keeper of that little world. He liked knowing where they were. He liked knowing what they needed. And perhaps, somewhere beneath all the good reasons he had given Rebecca, he liked the fact that they still needed his cabin to remain the center of their lives. For the first time, Jason wondered whether keeping someone safe and keeping someone dependent could sometimes look frighteningly similar from the outside. By the middle of May, the last stubborn patches of snow had disappeared from the shaded edges of the woods around Lake Placid, and the mornings arrived with wet grass, bird song, and the smell of pine warming in the sun. Ellie, Max, and Charlie were no longer the fragile puppies Jason had carried home in a travel crate. They were growing quickly now, all legs, oversized paws, and inconvenient curiosity. Charlie had developed a habit of stealing one shoe but never its matching partner. Ellie had discovered that fallen pine cones deserved several minutes of careful investigation. Max had begun sleeping on his back in patches of sunlight, an undignified position for a puppy who spent most of his waking hours acting as if he had been appointed head of household security. Their bodies were healing faster than their habits, and Rebecca's question from the previous month still followed Jason around the cabin. Was he looking at love, or was there fear inside it too? This time, Jason did not begin with a larger goal. He began with 30 seconds. Charlie went behind the baby gate while Ellie and Max remained in the kitchen. Jason stayed where Charlie could hear him but not use the other puppies as an emotional anchor. The first attempt lasted 32 seconds before Charlie began whining. Jason opened the gate before panic could build. The next day they tried 45 seconds. 2 days later, a minute. By the end of the week, Charlie could remain alone for almost 5 minutes if he had the faded blue ball he had discovered outside. Jason had expected progress to resemble a staircase. Instead, it looked like a mountain trail drawn by someone who had forgotten where the mountain was. One afternoon, Charlie stayed quietly in the den for 20 minutes, rolling the ball under a chair and retrieving it. The following morning, he started crying after 5. Jason called Rebecca. "We went backward." "No," she said. "You had a difficult morning." That sounds like a polite way to say backward. It's a more accurate way. Rebecca reminded him that confidence was not a switch. Fatigue, unfamiliar sounds, hunger, changes in routine, any of those could temporarily make an old fear louder. The mistake would be deciding one bad day erased 3 good weeks. Jason had spent most of his professional life in environments where improvement was measured against a standard. Here, the standard kept moving because the subjects were alive. It irritated him. It also forced him to pay attention. Ellie's work looked different. Jason began taking her alone along the short gravel road outside the cabin. On the first walk, she reached the mailbox and stopped, twisting her head repeatedly toward the house, as if expecting Max to appear and approve the next section of road. Jason waited. He did not pull the leash. After a minute, Ellie stepped forward on her own. The next morning, she stopped sooner. 2 days later, she walked past the mailbox and investigated a clump of ferns. Then a delivery truck rattled along the road. Ellie froze. Her ears flattened and she backed toward Jason's legs. He almost lifted her. Instead, he moved off the road, gave her space, and waited until the truck passed. Ellie stood still for nearly a minute afterward. Then she sniffed the grass and walked 3 more steps. That afternoon, Jason wrote one sentence on the pad he kept near the refrigerator. "Confidence doesn't mean nothing scares you." He stared at it and added, "It means fear doesn't always get the final vote." Max's meals required still another approach. Jason fed him behind a low divider, away from Charlie's enthusiasm and Ellie's cautious hovering. At first, Max ate quickly and then remained beside the empty bowl, watching Jason's hands. Jason never removed the bowl while Max guarded it. He walked past without reaching. Sometimes he dropped an extra piece of food from a distance and continued walking. Nothing dramatic happened. That was intentional. Days passed. Then one evening, Max finished his food, looked at the bowl, looked at Jason, and walked away to lie near the fireplace. Jason almost called Rebecca immediately. Instead, he waited until the next meal. Max guarded the bowl again. Jason laughed once under his breath. "Of course you did." A week later, he walked away again, then again. Eventually, the empty bowl became exactly what an empty bowl should have been. A dish waiting to be washed, not a resource that might disappear forever. The puppies still spent most of their time together. They chased one another around the yard, slept in impossible arrangements, and argued over objects that became worthless the moment nobody else wanted them. Jason was not trying to make them strangers. That distinction became increasingly important to him. Independence did not require erasing attachment. It required making attachment a place someone could return to, rather than the only place someone could function. Helen Carter was learning a version of the same thing. Her condo purchase had gone through, and cardboard boxes now filled half the rooms of the house where she had lived for nearly 4 decades. Jason came over on weekends to help sort things. He assumed the work would be practical. It was not. Helen gave away an expensive dining set she had once insisted was too good for everyday use. She donated a polished silver serving tray that Jason remembered seeing at holiday dinners. Yet she refused to part with a small frying pan whose bottom had darkened permanently with age. "That pan is terrible," Jason said. "It makes eggs." "So does a new pan." Helen looked at him. "My husband burned pancakes in this one the morning Linda left for college." Jason picked it up again. The handle was loose. Helen also kept a chipped coffee cup with a faded blue stripe, a shoebox filled with birthday cards, and an inexpensive ceramic bird whose painted eye had worn nearly away. Meanwhile, objects Jason assumed carried great emotional importance were placed in donation boxes without hesitation. At one point, he held up a crystal vase. "That was expensive." Helen shrugged. "It was also ugly when I bought it in 1989. Jason laughed. He was beginning to understand how arrogant practicality could become. A stranger could assess an object by price, condition, usefulness, or replacement cost, and still know absolutely nothing about its value to the person holding it. The same was true of houses. Perhaps dogs, too. By early June, more than a month of gradual work had changed the puppies in ways Jason could no longer dismiss as temporary improvements. Charlie could stay in another room and entertain himself without immediately searching for Ellie and Max. Ellie sometimes entered unfamiliar spaces before Max did. Max could eat calmly and tolerate Jason moving nearby without assuming the food was threatened. None of them had become perfectly confident. Charlie still had difficult mornings. Ellie still disliked sudden noises. Max still watched his bowl more closely when tired. But they were becoming themselves. Rebecca arrived at the cabin on a warm afternoon carrying a folder. Jason knew from her expression that the visit was not only about weight charts. "The ownership case is finished," she said. Jason looked at the 3 dogs playing in the yard. "So they belong to the rescue now?" "Yes, legally and permanently." "That's good." "It is." He heard the word she had not said. "And now?" "We can start looking at permanent homes." His answer came so quickly it surprised even him. "They can stay here." Rebecca did not react immediately. "I can keep all 3. "I know you could keep them tomorrow," she said. Jason frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm asking about 10 years from now." He crossed his arms. Rebecca remained calm. 3 adult German Shepherds, your training schedule, possible transfers, travel, deployment cycles, veterinary care, exercise, housing. What happens if your assignment changes? I'd figure it out. I believe you would try. The wording irritated him. Rebecca looked toward the yard where Charlie was running in an unnecessary circle, while Ellie watched and Max carried a stick much too large for him. "This isn't a test of how much you love them, Jason." He did not answer. "And finding homes doesn't mean they leave next week. We do it slowly. We match them individually. We let you be part of the process." "They're doing well here." "Yes." "Then why change something that works?" Rebecca studied him for a moment. "Because works now and best for the next decade are not always the same answer." After she left, Jason stood by the back door. The puppies saw him. Charlie arrived first, almost colliding with the steps. Ellie followed at a calmer pace. Max came last, still carrying the absurd stick. 3 dogs, 3 familiar faces, 3 bodies that had once been small enough to gather beside his boots. Jason looked at the calendar hanging near the refrigerator. Several blocks in the coming months were already marked for training. Beyond them were assignments he could not predict. He had spent weeks teaching Ellie, Max, and Charlie not to confuse distance with abandonment. Now the lesson had turned around and was looking directly at him. The question was no longer whether he loved them enough to keep them. Of course he did. The harder question was whether he loved them enough not to mistake what he wanted for what their entire future should become. By late June, Lake Placid had turned green and bright, the roads dry beneath the maples, and the long evenings stretching well past dinner. Ellie, Max, and Charlie were almost 5 months old now, and the cabin no longer looked as though it belonged entirely to Jason. There were chew toys beneath chairs, folded blankets near the back door, 3 water bowls along the kitchen wall, and fur appearing in places Jason had stopped trying to explain. He had spent months teaching the puppies that separation did not mean abandonment. Now Rebecca was asking him to prove he believed the same thing. They agreed on one rule before meeting any potential adopters. No puppy would leave because a family simply liked that dog best. Each placement had to match the individual animal that had emerged during the previous months. Ellie needed patience, quiet, and people who did not mistake hesitation for disobedience. Max needed structure without confrontation, especially around food. Charlie needed activity, companionship, and a household that would enjoy his energy without allowing him to depend on constant attention. Rebecca arranged the first meetings at Jason's cabin because the puppies were comfortable there. The families would enter their world first. Only later would the dogs be asked to enter theirs. Margaret Lewis arrived for Ellie on a warm Saturday morning with her husband Thomas. At 66, Margaret had a slender build, silver hair cut into a neat chin-length bob, soft gray eyes, and the composed manner of someone who had spent decades surrounded by people who needed silence without being told to be quiet. She had retired after 35 years as a public librarian and still carried a paperback almost everywhere, the corners of its pages marked with tiny slips of paper. Margaret spoke gently, but she was not overly sweet. She had raised 2 children and cared for her mother through the final years of her life, experiences that had taught her that love could be patient without becoming passive. Thomas Lewis, 69, was broad through the shoulders, despite a slight stoop, with thinning white hair, a weathered face, and a neatly trimmed gray mustache. A retired high school history teacher, he had the dry humor of a man who enjoyed watching his wife win arguments he had wisely chosen not to join. He liked dogs, but he admitted immediately that Margaret was the one who had spent weeks reading about fearful puppies. Ellie stayed near Jason when the couple entered. Margaret did not call her. She did not kneel, clap, offer food, or say, "Come here, sweetheart." She sat in a chair near the window, opened her book, and began reading silently. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Ellie watched her from behind Jason's leg. Eventually, curiosity defeated caution. She crossed the room slowly, stopped 2 feet from Margaret, sniffed the air, then stepped close enough to inspect one sensible brown shoe. Margaret did not move. Ellie sniffed the other shoe. Thomas whispered, "I think you've passed the footwear inspection." Margaret kept her eyes on the page. "Don't ruin it." Jason smiled despite himself. Max's potential adopter was Robert Jenkins, 55, a carpenter from Saranac Lake. Robert was tall but slightly heavy through the middle, with powerful forearms, a square face, short iron-gray hair, and a beard trimmed close around a mouth that rarely wasted words. 2 German shepherds had shared his life over the previous 20 years, and the second had developed resource guarding after a difficult early history. Robert did not describe himself as an expert. In fact, he distrusted people who announced themselves that way. When Rebecca explained Max's history with food, Robert nodded. "So I don't prove to him that I can take the bowl?" he said. Rebecca waited. "I prove to him that I don't need to." Jason looked at him differently after that. Robert spent most of his first meetings sitting on the porch steps while Max wandered nearby. He never reached over Max's head. When Max brought a stick close, Robert rolled another stick away instead of trying to take the first one. Max stared at him, considered the arrangement, and ran after the second. Charlie's family arrived last. Amy Foster was 43, a physical therapist with auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail, freckles across fair skin, and the energetic warmth of someone accustomed to encouraging people through difficult work without pretending it was easy. Her husband, Brian, 45, was lean, dark-haired, clean-shaven, and worked remotely as an architectural designer. Brian was quieter than Amy, and admitted that he was the person in the family most likely to notice when everyone else needed to stop talking. Their 16-year-old daughter Megan had long brown hair, blue eyes, and the long-legged awkwardness of adolescence not entirely unlike Charlie himself. She loved hiking, photography, and had specifically told her parents she did not want a cute puppy they would get tired of after 6 months. Charlie greeted them as if he had been waiting all year for an audience. Within 5 minutes he had brought Megan 2 toys, attempted to inspect Brian's backpack, and stolen one of Amy's gloves. "He seems subtle," Brian said. Jason laughed. "He gets worse." "That sounded proud," Amy said. Jason pretended not to hear. The meetings continued over the next several weeks. Nobody took a puppy home after a single afternoon. Margaret and Thomas returned 4 times before Ellie visited their house. Robert spent time walking Max alone with Jason before Max ever entered Robert's truck. The Foster family took Charlie on short hikes near the cabin, then brought him to their home for a few hours. The first trials were intentionally small. Ellie spent an afternoon at Margaret's quiet house and came back tired but calm. Max visited Robert's workshop, where he startled at the sound of a dropped board but recovered after several minutes. Charlie spent half a day with the Fosters and apparently discovered that Megan's bedroom contained more socks than Jason's house had ever offered him. The next stage was a full day, then an evening, then an overnight stay. Jason hated how ordinary the process became. He had imagined adoption as a single terrible moment. Instead, it arrived as calendars, packed food, written instructions, text messages, and returns that slowly became less necessary. At the same time, Helen was leaving her own home. Jason helped her carry the final boxes from the house she had lived in for nearly 40 years. The kitchen was almost empty now. The table had already been donated, leaving 4 pale rectangles on the hard wood where its legs had protected the floor from sunlight. Helen stood looking at them. Jason waited by the doorway. For several seconds she said nothing, then her face folded in a way Jason had rarely seen, and tears came quietly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "No, it's just a floor." Jason looked at the marks. "No," he said again. Helen wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. "We had breakfast there the morning Linda went to college. My husband sat at that end every Christmas, because he insisted he needed the chair nearest the kitchen, though he never once brought anything to the table." She laughed through the tears. Jason could have told her the condo was easier to maintain, safer, closer to town. A few months earlier he probably would have. Instead, he stood beside her. After a while, Helen said, "A right decision can still hurt." Jason looked at the empty place where the table had been. "Yes," he said. Ellie's permanent move was scheduled 3 days later. Jason packed her food, medical records, favorite blanket, and a worn rubber toy she barely played with but always seemed to know was hers. He drove her to Margaret and Thomas's house himself. They stayed for several hours. Ellie explored the fenced yard. She drank water. She rested beneath Margaret's chair. She followed Thomas into the kitchen and returned without Jason calling her. Every small success made his chest feel tighter. Finally, there was nothing left to explain. Jason stood. "I should go." Ellie rose immediately. For one foolish second, hope moved through him. She followed him to the doorway. Jason opened it and stepped onto the porch. He waited. A part of him wanted Ellie to cry. He hated himself for that thought, but it was true. He wanted her to scratch at the door, strain after him, do anything that proved leaving him was difficult. Ellie stood in the doorway and looked at him. Her tipped ear shifted. Then Margaret sat down behind her. Ellie turned. She walked back inside and lowered herself beside Margaret's feet. No panic, no crying, no desperate attempt to follow. Jason stood on the porch longer than necessary. Margaret did not tell him Ellie would forget him. She did not tell him everything would be fine. She simply said, "We'll take good care of her." Jason nodded and walked to his truck. The drive back to the cabin felt much longer than the drive out. When he arrived, Max and Charlie ran toward him. There should have been 3. The absence was immediate, painfully precise. Jason crouched between the two dogs and let them sniff Ellie's scent on his clothes. He did not like the emptiness she had left behind, but as he looked toward the road she would not be coming back down that night, he understood something Helen had already learned in her empty kitchen. A decision could hurt without being wrong, and Ellie's willingness to remain with Margaret, the very thing Jason had secretly hoped she would refuse to do, was proof that the frightened puppy who once could not eat without her family beside her had finally learned that home could exist somewhere new. July settled warmly over Lake Placid, bringing long evenings, green roadsides, and the steady hum of insects beyond the cabin screens. Ellie had been gone for 2 weeks, and although Jason had expected Max and Charlie to spend those days searching every room for her, the reality was quieter. Max checked the hallway more often than before, and sometimes paused beside the blanket Ellie had used, while Charlie seemed determined to compensate for the missing dog by becoming twice as noisy. He stole Jason's socks, dragged sticks through the kitchen, and once carried an empty food bowl into the living room as though demanding an explanation for why dinner had ended. Their grief, if that was the right word, did not look theatrical. It looked like small habits with one place suddenly empty. Robert Jenkins came for Max on a clear Saturday morning. By then, Max had spent several full days and 2 overnight visits at Robert's house near Saranac Lake. Robert arrived in his old pickup, wearing work boots, faded jeans, and a gray cotton shirt with sawdust still clinging to one sleeve. At 55, he had the solid hands and square shoulders of a man who had worked with lumber most of his life, and his iron-gray beard made his expression look sterner than it was. He did not arrive carrying gifts. He brought Max's familiar bed, the same ceramic water bowl Max had used during the overnight trials, and a printed feeding schedule Rebecca had helped him prepare. Jason appreciated that more than he wanted to admit. "You still feeding him in the side room?" Jason asked. "For now." "And you leave the bowl down until he walks away?" "I remember." "He sometimes circles back." "I know. He doesn't like anyone standing directly behind him when he eats." Robert looked at Jason for a moment. "You planning to climb in the truck with him?" Jason almost smiled. "Just making sure." "I know." Max seemed to understand something was different. He moved between Jason and Robert several times, then went to inspect the truck. When Robert opened the rear door, Max jumped in without being lifted. That hurt more than Jason had expected. Charlie barked from the porch. Max looked toward him. For several seconds, Jason wondered if the dog would jump back down. Instead, Max sat. Robert closed the door gently. Jason rested one hand against the truck for a moment, then stepped away. The first update arrived that evening. Max had eaten his entire meal. The second came just after midnight. He had paced for nearly half an hour, checked the front door repeatedly, and finally fallen asleep beside Robert's workbench instead of on the bed prepared for him. Jason stared at the message longer than necessary. The next morning, Robert sent a photograph. Max was asleep on his side in a square of sunlight, one paw resting against the leg of the workbench. 2 nights later, he paced again. On the 4th night, he slept through. He continued eating. He showed no serious return of the food-guarding behavior Jason had worried about. That was when Jason stopped waiting for the phone to ring with bad news. Charlie, meanwhile, became the only dog in the cabin. The first week was harder than Jason had expected. Charlie followed him everywhere. Bathroom, kitchen, garage, back porch. If Jason crossed from one room to another, Charlie appeared behind him so quickly that Jason began joking that he had acquired a furry shadow with terrible spatial awareness. At night, Charlie chose the rug beside Jason's bed. During the day, he carried toys to wherever Jason happened to be and dropped them against his feet. Jason worried that months of work had collapsed the moment Ellie and Max left. Rebecca disagreed. "He's adjusting. He looks dependent. He has lived almost his entire remembered life with those 2 dogs. So I should let him follow me everywhere?" "No, but don't punish him for noticing they're gone." Jason hated advice that required patience without giving him a deadline. Still, he followed it. He kept Charlie's routine stable. Meals stayed at the same times. Walks continued. Short periods alone remained part of each day. Jason did not suddenly compensate for Ellie and Max's absence by filling every quiet moment with attention. Slowly, something changed. One afternoon, Jason realized he had been working at the kitchen table for almost 20 minutes without Charlie under his chair. He found the dog in the guest room. Charlie was lying alone with the faded blue ball between his paws. He looked up when Jason entered, then returned to chewing the ball. Jason stood in the doorway. "Well," he said, "apparently I'm no longer essential." Charlie ignored him. A week later, Charlie began choosing the porch in the evenings. He would stretch out near the steps, watching birds move through the yard or staring into the trees with an expression so serious that Jason sometimes wondered whether the dog was contemplating the meaning of life or simply waiting for a squirrel to make a tactical error. The most surprising moment came one night when Jason went upstairs. Charlie did not follow. Jason stopped halfway up and looked back. Charlie was curled on the living room rug several yards from the stairs. "You coming?" Charlie lifted his head, then put it down again. Jason continued upstairs alone. Something in him felt oddly proud, and oddly unnecessary. Helen Carter was experiencing her own version of adjustment across town. Her new condo had not transformed her life into the effortless retirement brochure Linda had imagined. Helen complained about the heavy lobby door, the elevator that seemed determined to stop on every floor, and the man above her who walked across his apartment late at night with what she described as the feet of a small horse. She called Jason 3 times in 1 week because she could not find things she herself had packed. "The blue kettle is gone." "You packed it." "I know I packed it." "Then it's in a box." "I have 17 boxes, Jason. That is not useful information." 2 hours later, she called again. "I found it." "Where?" "In the kitchen." He laughed until she hung up on him. But the condo also began offering things Helen had not expected. She could walk to a small coffee shop without starting her car. The library was 6 blocks away. A Thursday book club met in the community room downstairs. That was where she met Ruth Bennett. Ruth was 73, a widow of 9 years, short and round-faced with soft brown skin, cropped silver curls, and large tortoiseshell glasses that made her dark eyes look permanently amused. She had spent most of her career as a payroll clerk for a regional hospital and possessed the quietly mischievous humor of someone who had survived decades of office meetings by observing how seriously people took themselves. Ruth had moved into the building 2 years earlier, after selling a house that had become too much work, and she refused to describe the move as either wonderful or tragic. "It's an apartment," she told Helen. "Not heaven, not prison. The plumbing works." Helen liked her immediately. They began walking to coffee together twice a week. Jason noticed the change not because Helen suddenly stopped missing her old house. She did not. She still spoke about the maple tree outside her former kitchen window. She still disliked the upstairs footsteps. She still occasionally wondered whether she had moved too soon. But now those complaints existed beside other things. A book Ruth had recommended, a bakery they planned to try, a neighbor whose tiny dog wore sweaters Helen found ridiculous but secretly adored. Jason began understanding that transition did not require someone to stop loving what had come before. Near the end of July, Charlie completed his final overnight stay with Amy, Brian, and Megan Foster. He returned tired, happy, and carrying a tennis ball nobody remembered packing. Rebecca examined the notes from the family and looked at Jason. "He's ready." Jason nodded. He had known the words were coming. Knowing did not make them pleasant. Charlie's permanent move was scheduled for the following week. On the final morning, Amy parked beside the cabin while Megan opened the back of the SUV. Brian had stayed home to prepare the yard and set up Charlie's bed. Jason handed Amy a folder. "He hates the vacuum." Amy nodded. "Not scared, exactly. More personally offended. I remember. He likes the hairdryer." Amy laughed. "You've mentioned that 3 times." And he'll steal socks, but usually only one. Jason, I'm just making sure. Charlie appeared from behind them carrying the blue ball. Jason crouched. He had imagined saying something meaningful. Charlie had other plans. Megan opened the rear door. Charlie saw the blanket and his travel toy inside. He dropped the blue ball, bounded past Jason, and jumped into the vehicle before anyone invited him. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Megan laughed. Amy covered her mouth. Jason looked at Charlie sitting proudly in the back seat. Unbelievable. Charlie wagged his tail. After everything I've done for you. The dog sneezed. That made Jason laugh too. The laughter helped. Not much, but enough. When the SUV disappeared down the road, Jason returned to the cabin. That evening he entered the kitchen and automatically looked at the floor before stepping around the table. There was nothing to avoid. No Max stretched across the walkway, no Ellie waiting cautiously near the doorway, no Charlie carrying something he had stolen. Jason stopped. The silence was not peaceful yet. It was simply empty. From the living room came the slow ticking of his father's old pendulum clock. 7 minutes behind. Tick, tick, tick. For years Jason had thought about having it repaired. That night he sat in the chair beneath it and listened. For once he did not feel the need to make it keep better time. 18 months later, autumn returned to Lake Placid. With copper leaves along the roads, cold rain against the windows, and the first thin frost whitening the grass before sunrise. The 3 frightened puppies, who had once fit together beside Jason Miller's boots, had become adult German shepherds approaching 2 years old, each broad-chested, strong-legged, and unmistakably shaped by the home that had claimed them. Ellie lived with Margaret and Thomas Lewis, where she had developed the habit of following Margaret from room to room without needing to touch her, often settling beneath a chair while Margaret read. Max spent much of his time near Robert Jenkins's workshop, sleeping through the sounds of saws and tools that would once have kept him alert, his old insecurity around food reduced to an occasional glance rather than a rule governing his life. Charlie had become exactly the dog the Foster family expected, and somehow more chaotic than any of them had predicted. Am sent Jason photographs of him on hiking trails, asleep beside Megan's backpack, and once sitting proudly in the middle of a pile of laundry with a single sock hanging from his mouth. Jason still received updates. He occasionally visited. But he had kept one promise to himself that nobody else had asked him to make. He would not turn gratitude into obligation. Ellie, Max, and Charlie were allowed to have lives in which Jason was important without being necessary. The call came from Margaret on a wet October evening. Jason was cleaning up after dinner when his phone lit with her name. Margaret rarely called without sending a message first. "Ellie's in the veterinary hospital," she said. Her normally even voice sounded tired. Ellie had developed a respiratory infection several days earlier. She was receiving appropriate veterinary treatment, and Rebecca believed the medication had begun doing what it was supposed to do. The greater concern was that Ellie had become intensely stressed in the unfamiliar hospital environment and had nearly stopped eating. She would accept a little water, then retreat. Margaret had stayed with her for hours, but the routines that usually soothed Ellie seemed weaker inside a room filled with unfamiliar sounds and smells. "She's not getting worse because the medicine is wrong," Margaret said carefully. "Rebecca thinks she's frightened enough that everything is becoming harder." Jason stared through the kitchen window at rain running down the glass. "What do you need me to do?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Rebecca asked whether you might come." Not whether he could fix it, not whether Ellie needed rescuing, only whether he might come. That distinction mattered now. Jason grabbed his jacket and headed toward the hospital. Halfway there, he called Helen. At 72, Helen Carter had been living in her Lake Placid condo for well over a year. He still disliked the upstairs neighbor's footsteps. Ruth Bennett had convinced her to join a second book club, which Helen complained was excessive while attending every meeting. She hired someone to clear snow, used the handrails she had once treated as symbols of defeat, and no longer drove when winter roads were icy. None of those things had been forced upon her. That mattered more than Jason once would have understood. Helen listened as he explained. Then she asked, "Will she remember you?" "I don't know." A pause. "And if she does, is Margaret still home?" Jason tightened his hand around the steering wheel. "I don't know that either." "You'll find out." Rebecca met him at the hospital. She looked much the same, though there was more gray in her chestnut hair now, and the years of careful patience still lived in the lines around her eyes. "She's stable," Rebecca said before Jason could ask. "The treatment needs time. What we need from you is less impressive. Good. I specialize in less impressive now." Rebecca smiled. "Sit with her. Don't ask for anything." That sentence would once have irritated him. Now it sounded familiar. Ellie lay on a blanket near the back of the quiet room. She was no longer the tiny puppy with the tipped ear and fragile legs. She had grown into a graceful black and tan shepherd with a strong frame, a darker saddle across her back, and the same slightly angled ear that made Jason recognize her instantly. Yet illness had softened her usual alertness. She lifted her head when the door opened, then lowered it again. Jason entered and sat on the floor. He did not call her name. He did not reach toward her. For several minutes, nothing happened. The silence took him back almost 2 years, to a cabin kitchen, 3 untouched bowls, and the night he finally understood that trying harder was not always the same as helping. Ellie raised her head again. This time she looked directly at him. Her ears shifted, her nose worked slowly. Jason remained still. Ellie stood. She crossed the room without hurry and stopped in front of him. For a moment she only looked at his face. Then she lowered her head onto his thigh. Jason closed his eyes briefly. "Hey, kid," he whispered. That was all. Rebecca later brought a small portion of food prepared according to Ellie's treatment plan. Jason set it within reach and moved his hands away. Ellie sniffed, waited, then began to eat. Not much, enough. There was no miracle in the room. Jason understood that clearly. Medicine was treating the infection. Rebecca and the veterinary team had made the medical decisions. Time would determine how quickly Ellie recovered. Jason had not arrived carrying a cure. What he had carried was a memory. Some part of Ellie remembered what safety had once felt like beside him, and for that evening the memory helped her accept what her body needed. Jason visited again the following day. By the 3rd day, Ellie's appetite was improving. Her energy had begun returning, and she was spending more time standing instead of curling away from the room. Margaret entered during one of Jason's visits. Ellie saw her. The dog lifted her head immediately, stood and walked away from Jason without hesitation. She crossed the room and pressed herself against Margaret's legs. Jason felt the sting before he could stop it. A small, selfish ache. Then Margaret placed one hand lightly against Ellie's shoulder, and Ellie relaxed. Jason smiled. Helen's question had been answered. Ellie remembered him. But Margaret was home. 2 truths could live beside each other without one diminishing the other. By early winter, Ellie had fully recovered. Margaret suggested bringing her back to Jason's cabin for a visit, and somehow the idea expanded until Robert agreed to bring Max, and the Foster family brought Charlie. Jason worried the reunion would disappoint everyone. It nearly did. For the first few seconds, the 3 adult shepherds simply sniffed one another with enormous seriousness. Then Charlie recognized Max, or perhaps Max recognized Charlie. Whatever happened, dignity ended immediately. Charlie lunged into a playbow. Max chased him across the yard. Ellie joined half a minute later, and soon all 3 were racing through the thin snow, wrestling, stealing the same stick, and behaving with enough foolish enthusiasm to make every adult watching laugh. Helen came too, bundled in a dark wool coat with Ruth's knitted scarf wrapped around her neck. For nearly an hour the dogs played. Then something quieter happened. Margaret called Ellie. Ellie went to her. Robert whistled once, and Max abandoned the stick to stand beside him. Amy opened the back of the SUV for water, and Charlie followed her immediately. Jason watched. Once, those 3 dogs had needed one another to eat, sleep, explore, and feel safe. Now they could love one another without needing one another to survive. After everyone left, Helen remained at the cabin while Jason made coffee. The old pendulum clock ticked from the living room, still 7 minutes slow. Helen glanced toward it. "You know," she said, "there are people who repair those. I've heard rumors. You spent half your childhood complaining about that clock." "I remember. So why haven't you fixed it?" Jason looked at the wooden case his father had wound every Sunday. His father's old words returned to him. "Not everything that runs differently is broken." Helen smiled. "Took you long enough." "That seems appropriate." Outside, 3 sets of tire tracks led away from the cabin in different directions. Jason stood by the window and watched the last vehicle disappear. He did not feel as though 3 dogs had been taken from him. He thought instead about a frightened little family that had needed one another desperately, then needed him for a while, and eventually needed enough room to become something larger than what fear had made them. Ellie had not healed at Charlie's speed. Max had not learned trust the way Ellie did. Helen had not grown older according to her daughter's preferred plan. Jason had not learned to let go in one noble moment. Nothing important in the story had kept perfect time. Behind him, the old clock ticked 7 minutes late and kept moving forward anyway. And perhaps that was enough. A happy ending did not always mean keeping those you loved within reach. Sometimes it meant watching them leave through different doors, knowing that if they ever looked back, it would not be because they were afraid to go. It would simply be because somewhere along the road they had learned that love could remain even after dependence was gone. Maybe the miracle in this story was never that Jason saved 3 frightened puppies. Maybe it was that he learned, love is not proven by how tightly we hold on, but by whether the ones we love become strong enough to stand without us. We often confuse protection with control. Parents do it, spouses do it, adult children do it with aging parents. We mean well, but sometimes fear makes us decide for people instead of walking beside them. Ellie, Max, Charlie, and Helen each grew in a different way, at a different pace. None of them needed to be forced into someone else's idea of progress. Perhaps that is one of the quiet ways God works in our lives, not always through a dramatic miracle, but through patience, timing, and the right person staying long enough for fear to loosen its grip. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need this reminder. Tell me in the comments what letting go with love means to you, and subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect your family, and give hopefully to know when to hold on and when to gently open your hands.